You have been told your whole life that power belongs to presidents, generals, billionaires, and people whose names end up carved into stone. But here is the uncomfortable truth that almost no one says out loud. Power shapes your life long before it ever reaches the White House. And the people who fail to understand it are the ones it uses most mercilessly. So let me ask you something unsettling right now. In the first seconds of this story, who decided how much your work is worth? Who decided which laws protect you and which ones don't? Who decided which wars you would pay for and which freedoms you would trade for safety? And why wasn't it you? Because this documentary is not about kings and crowns or dusty thrones. It's about you sitting there thinking power is someone else's problem, while history quietly proves that ordinary people who don't understand power don't remain ordinary for long. They become expendable, and by the end of this film you will see power not as a conspiracy or a buzzword, but as a living force that rewards those who understand its rules and crushes those who ignore them. So stay with me, because what you're about to hear may change how you vote, how you work, how you trust, and how you protect yourself. And if you care about your future in America, hit subscribe now, because this channel exists to teach what history whispers but never shouts. Imagine for a moment that you are a farmer in colonial America. Not famous, not powerful, just a man with dirt under his nails and a family to feed. And one morning a tax collector rides into town and tells you that a distant king, someone you will never meet, whose face you've never seen, has decided you owe more than you can pay. And you might think this is ancient history. But this moment is the heartbeat of power itself, because power is not the crown. It is the ability to make decisions that shape other people's lives without asking their permission. And most people living under that crown didn't wake up dreaming of revolution. They woke up wanting peace, stability, and bread on the table. Yet history shows us again and again that when ordinary people don't understand how power operates, they become its quiet victims. Because power doesn't announce itself with drums and banners. It creeps in through laws, customs, habits, and fear, and by the time you realize what it has taken from you, it already feels normal. The American Revolution did not begin because everyone suddenly read philosophy and agreed on liberty. It began because regular people slowly realized that power had been exercised over them without restraint, without representation, and without consequence. And the lesson here is not patriotic nostalgia, it is psychological reality. People tolerate power until it hurts too much, and by then the cost of resisting it is far higher than the cost of understanding it early. Fast forward a few decades and watch how this pattern repeats itself as the Constitution is written. Not as a perfect document, but as a warning, because the men who wrote it were obsessed with one question. How do you prevent power from concentrating in the hands of a few while most people remain ignorant of how it works? And the answer they attempted was balance, friction, checks, and limits, because they knew something that still feels uncomfortable today. Power naturally expands unless ordinary people know how to recognize it, challenge it, and restrain it. This is why understanding power is not academic, it is survival, because power doesn't care about your intentions, only your position. And history is filled with well-meaning citizens who believed that good leaders would always act in good faith, only to discover too late that systems reward control, not kindness. Look at the industrial age in America, when factory owners became titans and workers became numbers. And ask yourself how millions of ordinary people ended up working 14-hour days in dangerous conditions for wages that barely kept them alive. Because no villain announced himself as evil. Instead, power hid behind contracts, economic necessity, and the illusion of choice. And people who didn't understand the leverage being used against them blamed themselves instead of the system, believing they were unlucky or replaceable, when in truth they were strategically powerless. And it wasn't until unions, strikes, and public pressure forced power into the open that change occurred, proving again that power only negotiates when it is understood and confronted. Now shift your attention to the 20th century, to a world shaken by war and fear, where governments learned that controlling information could be just as effective as controlling armies, and ordinary citizens learned the hard way that power no longer needed chains when it could manufacture consent. Because once fear enters the equation, people willingly surrender freedoms they don't yet realize they will miss. And this is not ancient history either. Because every time a society faces crisis, power asks the same question: how much control can we take before people push back? And the answer depends entirely on how well ordinary people understand what is being done to them. In America, power learned to speak the language of safety, prosperity, and patriotism. And when power sounds like protection, it becomes harder to question. because questioning feels disloyal, irresponsible, or dangerous. And that is precisely why understanding power matters most when it claims to be acting in your best interest. Look at the civil rights movement and you will see this truth laid bare. Because power was not just enforced by laws, but by norms, silence, and fear, and millions of ordinary people accepted injustice not because they were cruel, but because power had convinced them it was natural, inevitable, or not their problem. And it took people who understood power, how it operated socially, legally, and psychologically, to expose its contradictions and force change, often at enormous personal cost. Because power never yields gracefully. It yields when resistance becomes more expensive than reform. Now pause, and bring this closer to home, closer to now, because power did not vanish with segregation or child labor or monarchies. It evolved. It became quieter, more complex, more embedded in systems that feel too large to challenge. And the modern American citizen is surrounded by power structures they are encouraged not to think about. Corporations that influence policy, algorithms that shape opinion, financial systems that reward debt and punish instability. And the most dangerous myth you have been taught is that understanding these forces is optional, because history shows that ignorance is not neutral, it is exploitable. Ordinary people often believe that power belongs to experts, politicians, or elites, and that their role is simply to live within the rules they are given. But this belief itself is a victory for power, because a population that sees itself as powerless will never challenge the forces that shape its destiny. And the irony is that power depends on this belief to survive, because even the most centralized authority collapses when enough ordinary people understand how it functions and withdraw their consent. This is why tyrannies fear education, why monopolies fear transparency, why unjust systems fear solidarity. Because knowledge turns compliance into choice, and choice is the enemy of unchecked power. Think about how often you hear people say politics doesn't matter, history is boring, power is corrupt anyway. And notice how convenient that apathy is for those who already hold influence. Because disengagement is not rebellion. It is surrender disguised as peace of mind. And history punishes surrender not with drama, but with slow erosion. Wages stagnate, rights shrink, trust dissolves, and people wake up one day feeling trapped in a system they never agreed to, forgetting that agreement is not always spoken. Sometimes it is assumed through silence. Power also understands psychology better than most people realize, because it knows that humans crave stability more than justice, familiarity more than freedom, and comfort more than truth. And this is why power often doesn't need to lie outright. It simply needs to frame reality in a way that feels tolerable, because people will defend a system that gives them just enough to lose. During the Cold War, Americans were told that fear justified secrecy, surveillance, and control, and many accepted it because the alternative felt riskier, and decades later, similar arguments return under new names, new technologies, new threats. But the same underlying logic, proving that power recycles strategies faster than societies learn lessons. Understanding power means recognizing these patterns before they harden into normality, before emergency measures become permanent, before exceptions become rules. And this is not about paranoia, it is about literacy. Because just as financial illiteracy leads to debt, power illiteracy leads to dependence. Consider how power operates economically, how systems are designed to reward those who already have leverage, while convincing those without it that failure is personal rather than structural, and how this belief keeps people working harder within broken systems instead of questioning the systems themselves. And this is perhaps one of power's greatest triumphs, turning systemic outcomes into individual shame, so that people blame themselves instead of organizing, reflecting, or resisting. History shows us that whenever ordinary people learn to name the forces acting upon them, power reacts defensively. Because clarity is destabilizing, and destabilization is dangerous for any hierarchy, which is why education has always been both celebrated and feared. Now let's talk about America specifically, because this nation was built on a contradiction that still defines it. A radical belief in individual freedom alongside a deep fear of disorder, and power has always lived in that tension, promising liberty while quietly constructing systems of control, and ordinary Americans have oscillated between demanding rights and accepting restrictions, often without fully understanding the trade-offs being made on their behalf. The founders warned against tyranny, but they also warned against apathy, because they understood that a republic cannot survive if its citizens outsource responsibility for power to institutions alone. And yet over time, complexity grew, governance became distant, and many people retreated into private life, trusting that someone else was watching the levers of control. But history is clear on this point. No one watches power unless they are forced to.
Everyone.
The Great
Please
Depression taught Americans that economic power could devastate lives without firing a single shot. And the New Deal taught them that power could also be redirected through collective action. But these lessons fade quickly when prosperity returns, because comfort dulls vigilance, and power thrives in moments when people believe the struggle is over. Move into the digital age and notice how power becomes invisible, embedded in platforms, data, and attention, shaping behavior without commands, influencing beliefs without force, and ordinary people scroll, click, and consume, rarely stopping to ask who benefits from their habits, their outrage, their distraction. Because modern power doesn't demand obedience, it harvests it passively, and understanding this is not optional in a society where influence moves faster than laws. The truth is that power today is not always about domination, it is about dependency, and systems that make life convenient also make it difficult to opt out. And history tells us that dependency is one of the most effective forms of control, because people rarely rebel against what they rely on. Throughout time, the individuals and movements that changed the course of history were not always the strongest or the richest, but they were almost always the most aware, because awareness turns fear into strategy, and strategy into leverage, and leverage into change. And this is the promise I make to you now. By the end of this documentary, you will not see power as something abstract or distant, but as a set of rules, incentives, and pressures that you can learn to recognize, question, and navigate. And this understanding will not make you cynical. It will make you harder to manipulate. You will see why some narratives repeat, why some reforms stall, why some crises are exploited, and why ordinary people are always told to stay calm while decisions are made above them. And you will realize that calm without comprehension is exactly what power prefers. History is not a parade of dates and names. It is a laboratory of human behavior under pressure, and every era leaves behind evidence of what happens when people understand power versus when they don't. And the pattern is relentless. Those who study it gain agency. Those who ignore it lose ground. This is not a call to anger. It is a call to attention, because attention is the first act of resistance.
We build our future.
And in a world competing for your focus, choosing to understand power is itself a radical act. So as this story unfolds, watch how empires rise not just through strength, but through consent. Watch how reforms succeed not just through morality, but through pressure. Watch how rights expand when people refuse to accept inevitability, and watch how quickly they shrink when vigilance fades. Remember that every freedom you enjoy was once contested by someone who claimed control was necessary, and every restriction you live with was once introduced as temporary. And the difference between those outcomes was not fate, it was understanding. If you take nothing else from this documentary, take this: power is not evil by default, but it is never neutral, and it always moves in the direction of least resistance. And ordinary people who understand this can bend history, while those who don't are bent by it. Stay with me through this journey, because the story of power is the story of how your world was shaped, and learning it is the first step toward shaping it back. And if this matters to you, if you believe ordinary people deserve more than a spectator's role in history, then subscribe, because what comes next will challenge how you see the past, the present, and your place within both.